All right. Thank you so much for having us. I'm Katrina VanHuss. This is my husband, Otis Fulton. We sometimes forget to tell people that we're married, and it gets a little awkward when we don't, because people think, oh, maybe then everything's not okay between those two, but it is. So I started Turnkey 29.75 years ago, and I feel like it's important to say I started that company because as a young woman, I felt like my opportunities were limited working for a major corporation. So started the company, and for 29 years, we've served nonprofits. One of my very first large clients was the American Cancer Society Relay for Life. And in the course of serving them, I saw that organization go from a few $1 million a year to $435 million a year in peer-to-peer fundraising. So that's where I really was educated, was in serving that organization. Also in the course of serving that organization, data began to present itself. So when I first started, there was no online fundraising. The world was very different. As soon as the online fundraising platforms started, suddenly there was a new kind of business intelligence, and we were able to study peer-to-peer fundraising in a very scientific way, which is what we did. What we learned is that people don't always react the way that we anticipate that they will, and that begat a study for us of the economics of peer-to-peer fundraising. Now, fast forward to about 6 years ago.
2013.
This is the story of how I got my giant. So we were both on a, I don't know.
Match.com.
Yeah. So we met online and got married very quickly. And Otis is a social psychologist, which is exactly what I needed at the time. Much cheaper to marry them than to hire them, much cheaper. So Otis came into Turnkey and into my life and helped us understand the human behavior, what was driving this phenomenon. And it turned out to be very successful in helping us understand and replicate the behaviors that we wanted in our fundraisers. So with that, the way we're going to organize the talk today is we're going to start with the psychology and a little bit of philosophy, and then we're going to move into what we call in America the brass tacks, or the logistics. How do you actually start a program or enhance a program? Okay, so with that, I'm going to let Otis jump in and talk a little bit about the psychology. I did want to let you know that we're looking at the English version of the slides because some of the slides, my slides, I don't know well enough not to have the English version, so that's what we're seeing. Go ahead, sweet.
Oh, good. Thank you for having us. Again, it is so good to be here. I'm a social psychologist, and many of us have taken social psychology classes at university and so forth, and they're interesting. They do clever experiments, they trick people, put them in unusual situations. But when you really get down and do a deep dive into doctoral level in social psychology, it becomes apparent that many of the things that you have taken for granted your whole life, your beliefs about why and how people behave the way they do, are really not right. And so what we try to do is take a look at these counterintuitive things and use that to best inform our clients how to raise funds. So I'm going to start out with talking about a study. Let's see, okay, that was done about 20 years ago. Actually, it's the inspiration for the title of our next book, The Beggar in the Doorway. Is going to be the title of our next one next year. And this is a study where they put a man who was obviously in distress in a doorway on a university campus. And he was asking the passersby, the students, for help. And the study was to see how many of the people would stop and help. Now, what do you think? Anyone have a guess? None of them? Oh, okay, we're in Russia, of course. Yes. Okay, well, yes, okay. Well, I'm not going to call on you anymore, Mita. I'm not going to call on you anymore. Well, would it help if I told you that actually it wasn't a university, just a university, it was a seminary. These were theology students. So these are people that, you would think would help people. Well, it turned out that sometimes 10% of people stopped, and sometimes 63% of people stopped, of the students. And the only thing that made a difference was whether or not they were late to class or not. And so the point of this is that behavior is mostly determined by the situation. Behavior is mostly situational. And we have this bias, this belief that people behave the way that they do because they're a certain type of person. They have an altruistic nature, or they're helpful, or they're kind, where really it has much more to do with the situation that people find themselves in. In fact, psychologists call this, I don't know where I'm pointing this, that there's a predictability ceiling of about 30%. And so let's say I would give you a test that would measure your attitudes about cheating, okay? And it was in any kind of an attitude. It would measure it. It would only predict how often you would cheat 30% of the time, and that's an upper limit. Most times, psychologists can't even come close to this 30%.
So what that means to you is that in the past, we have really leaned on the demographics of an audience because that's what we had available to us. So the fact that I'm Caucasian, I'm 56 years old, I'm female, we were using those attributes to build personas and trying to predict future behavior based on that persona, that set of facts about me. But what Otis is saying is that will, in the best case, perfect scenario, only let you predict my behavior, if it's perfect, 30% of the time. So the other 70% of the time is what you own, meaning that's the situation that you're going to create when you build your peer-to-peer program. That's the situation that is going to extract the behavior. So it's actually less important who the targets are, and more important, what you do to them.
Yeah, in fact, this is such a big principle that psychologists call it FAE, which stands for the fundamental attribution error. So the fundamental error that people make is that they believe that their behaviors are due to something, some disposition or personality characteristic that they have, and they ignored the effect of the situation completely. So I'm going to, let's take a look at why this might happen. I'm going to show you a little short video that was done in 1946. It's about 60 seconds, and I'd like you to just watch it. It's a little animated video, and then I'm going to call on a couple of people, not you, Mita, and ask what it is that you think you saw, okay?
So in the translation, I think, when they're going to answer.
No, yes, okay, fine. I'm going to tell my Russian joke instead because it may illustrate the point, okay? Okay, two men are standing on the opposite sides of the Volga River, okay? And one says to the other, "How do I get to the other side?" And the guy on the other side shouts back, "You are on the other side." Okay, now that's a psychologist joke. Not many psychologists here, okay, so perhaps not so funny. But the point is this, whenever we hear anybody, we automatically take their perspective. Okay, so when I say, "How do I get to the other side?" we assume that that person's perspective, and we're always looking at people to try to determine what their intentions are. In fact, the point of that video is what we do is psychologists call mind reading. Okay, we're always watching other people to try to determine what their intentions are. And so what we do is we determine their intentions by trying to figure out what kind of people they are. And we do that so that we can predict their behavior in the future. Now, so we're always subconsciously watching, trying to figure out why people are doing what it is they're doing. That's not that surprising, but what is surprising is we also do that to ourselves. We do exactly the same thing to ourselves. We're always watching our own behavior to try to determine what it is we think, we believe, our attitudes. And it feels different when we're watching ourselves because we have access to our emotions and our history and so forth that we obviously don't have when we're watching other people, but it's exactly the same process.
So we want to stop right there because this is such an important point. So you think it makes sense that your beliefs lead to your behaviors, right? That sounds like the way things work. But in fact, the way that we're built and what Otis just described is exactly the opposite. Your behaviors lead to your beliefs. So what that means is that if we can get people to behave in a different way, a certain way, we can actually impact what they believe. All right? Behavior leads to belief, is it?
And I'll give you an example of that. A friend of mine, John Jenker, at Stanford University, did a study, he's a psychologist there, and he had a simple question: how do people feel after doing someone a favor? And so he set up an experiment where subjects would come in and he'd allow them to win some money. They played a little game, would win about $10. And then, depending on the condition you were in, one of three things happened. The researcher would come to some of the subjects and he'd say, "I'm so sorry, I need to have that $10 back. That was out of my pocket. I don't have gas money. I need it to get home." So some of the people, the researcher asked for the money to get back. Some other people, another person came in, introduced themselves as the chairman of the department and said, "Hey, John shouldn't have given you that money. That's the department's money. I'm going to have to ask you for that back." Okay? Some of the other subjects just got to keep the money. And then the question was simply, who liked the researcher more? The people who were asked for the researcher for the money back? Was it the people who were asked by the department chairman for the money back? Or was it the people who got to keep the money? Who liked the researcher more?
So the audience says the first or the third. Nobody says seconds.
Okay. What's that say? Are we in the right one? Okay. Yeah, the people that liked the researcher more was the people who were asked by the researcher for the money back. Okay? Well, why is this the case? How can we explain this? What kind of people do we do favors for? So we did the researcher a favor. What kind of people do we do favors for? People we like, absolutely like. So we're watching ourselves, and if we do the researcher a favor, we're not thinking consciously, but unconsciously, we're thinking, oh, this must be someone I like. So it enhanced our liking for this person. And our message here is, every time that an individual does a favor for your organization, it's an opportunity for him to have a closer affinity to your organization, to like it more. But there's one important caveat: you have to recognize him for what he does for the organization. That's absolutely crucial.
This is a fun game to play every day. So, and Otis and I play this game every day. We play it with cranky people. We play it with angry people. When you're interfacing or talking to someone who's rude and impolite, the natural reaction is to try and, be nice to them, to do a favor for them so that they will like you more. But it actually works better if you ask for a favor from that person. And the angry cabbie, if you ask a favor, "I can't lift my bag, can you lift it for me?" They will like you better than if you do them a favor. And that's so counterintuitive to what we've been taught by our parents and by schools and by churches. It's very hard to break the habit and to do it the other way. It takes careful thinking.
So let's look at a study that was done a few years ago. This was a study that was done for people that had made some fairly large contributions to charity organizations. They're mostly civic organizations, things like museums and zoos and symphonies and so forth. They donated $250 to $2,500 a year to these organizations, but then they'd stopped donating. And so 98,000 people, they surveyed, and they asked them, well, why did you stop donating? And the most common reason was they weren't thanked for their previous gift. The second most common reason was they weren't asked to give again. The very last reason was they were asked too often. And yet we have this perception that, you know, in the United States it's called solicitation overreach. Don't ask for donations too often, whereas that's the very last reason they stopped giving. The most common reason was they just weren't asked, they weren't recognized, or they weren't asked again. But that's, again, counterintuitive to what we believe.
So now we're going to start getting a little bit more logistical. What the image you see on screen is it's the culminating event for a peer-to-peer endeavor. This particular client is called the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. And what you see there is what we describe as the culminating event, the end of fundraising typically, or that's when we come together and we celebrate the end and our success. The reason we show this is because there are a lot of things happening in this image that works really well. The first thing is they're all together. And one of the very important things that we give people when we give them this experience is the connection to something bigger than themselves. The other things you see some, hopefully you can see that, brightly colored balloons. And what they signify are the different roles that each person there has. One color means caregiver, one color means survivor, one color is family member. You know, there are a lot of different ways to recognize people and to say, I see you. But what we're going to go through now is to talk about some of the things that are going on in this picture and how they work. One of the things that we hear often when we talk to different groups and different clients, even more than groups like this, is we're different. It won't work with people with Down syndrome. This won't work with people with pancreatic cancer. This will not work with domestic violence. This will not work. It will not work in Russia. It will not work with Hispanic populations. I've heard that a lot. And the fact is, we're all human. And that's why this works. So we're going to talk about the human element even more.
Okay. So this is a picture of the African savanna. This is where 98% of our ancestors lived, and this is where our human brain evolved in order to survive. And the most important factor as to whether you survived or not on the African savanna, our ancestors, thousands and thousands of generations, was sociability, how well you got along with your group, your core group. And it turns out that recognition is a major social cue. You know, recognition, we were always, our antenna for recognition from our peers became very finely tuned because it told us that when there were resources, you know, think food, we were going to be included. So we were always watching how others in our social group were responding to us and recognizing us for how we contributed. And you know, this was a theory in psychology for many years. And then about 12, 15 years ago, MRI machines, brain scanners, became widely available, and they started testing some of these things. And the person who's the preeminent person in this, in the world, is at the University of California, Los Angeles. And he started putting people in these brain scanners and just having them read little simple recognition statements. Things like, when I need help, you're always someone I can count on to help me. And what they found is that when people read these recognition statements, the reward pathway of the brain that lights up is the same one that lit up when they ate their favorite food. So that's how fundamental the response to recognition is. It's as fundamental to your brain as is food. In fact, his name is Matthew Lieberman. He has a great quote in his book about this. He says, our brains crave the positive evaluation of others to an almost embarrassing degree. And that's because you would think that recognition would be meaningful from friends and family members. It doesn't even have to be anyone you know. Recognition from a complete stranger does the same thing to our brains as recognition from a friend or a family member. And you know, that's kind of borne out of the billions of dollars that is donated to charity every year in the United States, much less than 1% is donated anonymously. You know, we find being charitable to be pleasurable. Psychologists call it the warm glow effect. But we also want others to see us being charitable, and we know that people behave more charitably in public than they do in private. So, you know, one of our takeaways here is, you know, think about however you can to increase the observability of people's behaviors. Make it more public when they're doing these pro-social behaviors. I was reading an article about an organization that encouraged people to register to fundraise, and they set up a toll-free phone number, and no one called. And then they put the sign-up sheets outside their apartments where everyone could see them, and all of a sudden people started signing up because they knew everyone else would see that they're participating in this event. So make things as observable as possible. So let's talk about the type of relationships that you've got with your supporters in your organizations.
So I'll give you a moment to drink
good.
your water. So when we talk about peer-to-peer endeavors, the way that we think about them at Turnkey is that they're on a spectrum. And the spectrum ranges, which Otis will dig into here, ranges from things that are market-driven to things that are mission-driven or socially driven. And all of those are viable ways to execute a peer-to-peer initiative. A peer-to-peer initiative is not about an event, it's not about an activity, it's a process that you can apply in many, many different ways. Go ahead.
So I'm going to talk about another study here. You know, your supporters, they're in what is called, psychologists call social relationships with your organizations. When you ask people who are in social relationship why they do what they do, you know, they'll typically say something like, well, I just feel it's the right thing to do. You know, very, very simply, you know, it's something that I really believe in. And that's where you want to keep your supporters, because those are the type of people that will continue to support the organization over time. But if you're not careful, it's easy for these social relationships to get off track. And I'm going to describe an example of that. Israel has a series of public daycares, and they were having a problem. This was about 15 years ago. In the city of Haifa, they had a very large percentage of people who were picking up their kids late. Okay, they had about 25% who were picking up their kids late. This is a big problem, of course. So they went to a university, Yeshiva University, and they said, well, what is it we can do about this? And the folks at Yeshiva University said, well, why don't you impose a small fine? Why don't you, I think it was about $3 American, every time they come to pick up their kids late, just charge them $3 per kid for a late fee. And they said, okay, fine. And so they announced it to all the parents, and within 2 weeks, things had changed dramatically. What do you think had happened? What happened was, within 2 weeks, it went up to 40%. Okay? And it leveled off, and it stayed there for about 2 months. Now they had much bigger problems, so they went back to Yeshiva University, and they said, well, what should we do? And the people at Yeshiva University said, well, tell them that there will be no more fine. Tell them you're doing away with the fine. So they did away with the fine, and then what happened immediately was it went up to 48% late pickup. So now it was double what it was where it started. So, you know, what was it that's happening here? Well, people live in two different worlds. They live in a world of social relationships. I'm picking up my kid because it's the right thing to do. And they live in a world of market relationships, okay? They're doing it because there's some transaction involved. And these two worlds have different norms. And what had happened here was the parents had changed their social relationship, I'm picking up my kids, so it's the right thing to do, into a market relationship. I'm going to stay late at the office for 30 minutes because it only cost me $3. And we know that they changed their relationship because after They announced that the fine was no longer going to be imposed. Now it became an even better deal to stay 30 minutes late in the office. So it didn't change.
So the danger for us is that we sometimes can take people who have a strong mission attachment, and if we put them in a market relationship with us inadvertently, then we can actually weaken their mission attachment to us. And it's easy to do. It can happen in many different ways. It can happen with registration fees. It can happen with gifts that are too nice and that suddenly feel like pay. It can happen when we just start using words that feel like I'm buying something as opposed to I'm doing this because I want to. And we're going to dig more into what that looks like.
Yeah, we won't. I have a friend who teaches at Duke University, and he says, once you've offered to pay for her delightful holiday dinner, your mother-in-law will remember the incident for years to come. And you know what he talks about in his book is that once people go from I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do, a social relationship, to I'm doing it because I can make $3, it's very difficult to get them back to that social relationship. So beware of that. So I'm going to talk next about motivating, what this all means about motivating your volunteers.
And when we say volunteers, what we mean are people who fundraise for you, people who do mission work for you, and sometimes people who donate for you. I mean, if they're human, this works.
Psychologists talk about two different types of motivation, intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. I like this example of the soldier. I come from a military family, and if you poll soldiers, the United States has an all-volunteer army. They make very little money. I have a second cousin who's done 3 tours in Afghanistan, for example. And when you poll soldiers, they become much more patriotic after they've been in the military for a while than when they went in. And if you think about it, again, think about that we're always watching ourselves. Now, my second cousin makes $22,000 a year, makes very little money, risking his life. He's doing it voluntarily. So those two things, he's not being compensated, and he's doing it voluntarily. He's looking at himself and thinking, I must be a very patriotic person, and it changes attitudes. Do you want to say anything about that? No? Okay. All right.
No.
For the first time, you don't want to say anything about it. That's fine. The other type of motivation is extrinsic motivation, and that's actually what Katrina was doing with volunteers for many years before. Why don't you tell them what happened?
So one of the pieces of business intelligence that made itself apparent to us early on was with Relay for Life, what we found was the better the reward was for fundraising, the worse they would perform in the following year. They would actually do less fundraising the more reward they got for it. And when you think about that dynamic, they were looking at the gift going, oh, I must have done it for the gift, because we had flipped them into the market relationship. And so we began to change the way that we recognized people. And now reward is a bad word at Turnkey, because we know if I'm rewarding someone into a behavior, then I'm probably hurting my mission attachment. I'm probably hurting how hard they're going to work for me in the future if I do that. That is not to say, however, that there is no place for market relationships. If people already don't care about your mission, sometimes a market relationship is the way to get your first introduction to that person. And we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Yes, and it's not just giving people things. It can also be experiences that you can attach a price tag to. One of the things they do in the United States a lot is they do these obstacle courses. They're called Tough Mudders, and they cost about $100. And if you give someone a pass to a Tough Mudder, it's like giving them $100. Whereas, again, to reiterate this social relationship, no one comes and parks cars at your charity's event all weekend for a $1 T-shirt. Okay, no one would think, oh, I'm being compensated for a $1 T-shirt. But when you start giving them $30 gift cards, then there's this often unconscious little thought in their mind that says, I've been working for $30 for a whole weekend. And it can become very problematic. So, how do we develop this intrinsic motivation? Psychologists talk about intrinsic or self-labels. It turns out, interesting piece of research, if I can get you to say that you're a chocolate lover as opposed to someone who loves to eat chocolate, okay, that's very little difference there. Chocolate lover as opposed to someone who loves to eat chocolate. People who say they're chocolate lovers, they have a much higher preference for chocolate than people that just say they love to eat chocolate. It's the way that we label ourselves. And people label themselves in many ways. I've got a University of Virginia, my school ring on. I literally labeled myself. And so what we try to do is put people in situations where they label themselves as a cancer evangelist or a crusader for freedom of the press. All of these things that are associated with your cause.
So a good example of that, to go back to Relay for Life. Relay for Life has about 2.5 million people a year who participate in it, and every single person gets a T-shirt. And the real reason that the T-shirt works is not what we say out loud. What we say out loud is that it's for brand awareness, visual impressions. But the real reason we put a T-shirt on everyone who does Relay for Life every year is so that they look down and they literally see themselves in a Relay for Life T-shirt. And that's the way that we use their behavior to expand their belief in that particular mission.
Yeah, the most important eyeballs seeing that T-shirt belong to the people that are wearing the T-shirt. Absolutely right. So how do you get this process started? Psychologists call this the foot in the door technique. You have to make that first behavior as easy as possible. People will make all kinds of excuses to avoid supporting your organizations. There are many, many things that they can do with their time and their money and so forth. You've got to try to take away all of those pathways to them having an excuse for not behaving. So that first ask has got to be extremely, extremely small. But then once you're there.
So examples of that first ask might be take a survey, answer an email. I mean, we're talking about the lowest bar out there, and then you can escalate as they respond to you and increase their engagement. Their first point of engagement might be volunteering on the mission side. It could be donating, and then you transition them to a different kind of volunteer.
One thing you could do is do a direct response mailing, and Blackbaud, which is the big U.S. company that is the fundraising platform of choice there. They tell us that the direct response, the percentage responding yes to a direct response email, for example, is only 0.04%.
So to be clear, for people new to peer-to-peer, direct response is literally what it means. I am the organization, and I ask for a donation of a particular person. That's direct response. The peer-to-peer ask is second generation. So I ask Otis to ask Mita for money. That's the peer-to-peer ask, and that has a very different response rate.
Yes, the average response rate for peer-to-peer is 25%. So when little kids appear in your doorway, and if you're not getting 25%, something's wrong, because humans are humans. So if you are raising money on behalf of XYZ organization, you've got 4 friends. The average is one of those friends is going to say yes.
So, you see a statistic like that and you're like, well, why do we even bother with direct response? Why would we do that? And the reason is, to get to that peer-to-peer ask, to get that construct in place, takes some energy. Irina can attest, it takes some energy. Yeah, and you point all your resources, all your energy toward someone who's asking other people for money, which is very counterintuitive because we're used to communicating with donors, not fundraisers. But in this model, quite literally, we ignore the donor except for the thank you email and the later handling that they get. All the energy is put toward recruiting the fundraiser and giving them a great experience. Thoughts? Questions? Anybody? How are we doing? Are we doing good? Yeah. Okay, good, excellent.
Yeah, I want to tell you about an experience I had. These two little girls reminded me. About a year and a half ago, Saturday afternoon, doorbell rings. I go to the front door, and there are these two Boy Scouts. You know Boy Scouts? You know, meet a Boy Scout? Yeah. Two Boy Scouts standing there, brothers, 13, 10 years old, pimply-faced. You know, they had Boy Scout uniforms on. And they had a clipboard, and they said, "Are you Mr. Fulton?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And immediately I knew that these were not your usual Boy Scouts. These were compliance experts that were going to get my money. And I started to watch them very closely. And what had happened was their father had gone and gotten a list and matched up all the addresses with all the names of the people that lived there. So he said, "Well, I'm Jimmy, and this is my brother Mark. You may know our dad. We live over on Linderhaven Drive, which is 2 streets down from me." I didn't know their dad. He said, my dad's name's Sam. I didn't know him, but they're starting to take steps closer to me. They knew my name. Their dad was a neighbor. They're neighbors. They said, "Well, we're with Boy Scout Troop 79. You may have heard of the work we do collecting clothes for Christmas." And I hadn't, but that's a good thing. And they said, we're here collecting donations for the drive. Would you like to contribute?" And I didn't say anything before they could say, "Your neighbor Willie gave us $10. Now, I hate Willie because his dog attacked mine last year. And so I said, "I'll give you 20. Give you 20. True story. And so I said, let me go get some cash. She said, "Oh, no. No cash. We only take checks." So I said, "Fine." We got my checkbook. Now they had me writing the name of their organization, which as a psychologist I knew was a very powerful way to put that in my mind in a different way than just saying it. I wrote it. They said, "Oh, thank you so much. Would you go on? Would you give us our email? We'd love to email about how the drive comes out." And I said, "Of course I will." So I wrote my email address down, and they went off. Now, what they did, these two little geniuses, they had me in their affinity funnel, okay? I started out, I'd never heard of anything that they did. I had no affinity for them. But now I had a little bit of affinity because I'd given them $20. And what kind of people do I give money to? People I like. Okay, so they had their foot in the door. Didn't take much, all right? Now they started emailing me. You know what they were emailing me about? Were they asking me for more money? No, they were far too smart than to ask me for more money right away. They were asking me to come to their Shrimp and Suds beer barbecues. Would you like to come to our barbecues? Well, I never did go to their barbecues, but what kind of people do you get invitations to barbecues from? Your friends. So they worked me down the funnel, gave them $100 this year, okay? I'm well aware. I actually went on their website and saw what they were doing and so forth. I'm familiar with them. They worked me beautifully down the affinity funnel. They were beautiful compliance experts.
We went to Paris. Now, typically we don't go to tourist attractions, but we decided we had to go to the Eiffel Tower or we couldn't go home, right? And so we go, and once you start thinking about this, you just can't stop. And so as soon as we get off the bateau, we are approached by 2 women with clipboards. And they ask us things like, "Oh, is this your first time in Paris?" "Yes, it is." "Oh, are you having a good time?" "Yes, it is." So they've got me nodding yes. And then, like, "Would you sign our petition?" "Well, what is it?" And it sounded good to me. I'm like, "Okay, fine." So I signed their petition. And then they asked me for money. And at that point, I'm like, "Honey, you got to see these people work. They are good." Yeah, it was amazing. So, you know, those initial behaviors that they extract are so easy for you to say yes to. And that's the experience when you're designing your initiative to think about. Is it frictionless? Is it easy? Do I feel pushed? I shouldn't feel pushed. Maybe I should feel pulled,
This is a picture of a woman that's, have you heard the term cognitive dissonance? Cognitive dissonance, sure. People like to be consistent in their behaviors in a couple of ways. They like their past behaviors to be consistent with their present behaviors, okay? They also like their behaviors to be consistent with their attitudes. So the whole point of this is, if I can get you behaving in a certain way, that's going to change your attitude. And again, that's counterintuitive to how we usually think, because we usually think that people's attitudes determine how they behave, but psychologists know that it's actually the opposite. People's attitudes are determined by how they behave. Okay, so if I can get you behaving a certain way, you will change your attitude. Go ahead.
And of course, when you think back to the beginning of this presentation, 70% of my behaviors you guys are in control of, right? Because in this particular example, you're controlling the environment with the design of your initiative. So this is the way you influence how they believe, by influencing how they behave, over which you have quite a bit of control.
And the biggest example of that is, one of our clients, ALS, heard of the Ice Bucket Challenge? We did not come up with the Ice Bucket Challenge. They were not a client of ours when they did this. It was kind of a lucky thing. Americans call it catching lightning in a bottle. But what they did was they had people doing an extreme behavior, dumping water on their heads, and that translated to donations to ALS Foundation, $126 million in a month. It was so much money, it took them 6 months to count the money, because it was an example of this behavior leading to belief and going to the organization.
And what was really intriguing to me is the Ice Bucket Challenge happened pretty much on Facebook. It was viral. It was online. They also had a walk and a series of walks across the nation. And with no further investment than they had already planned, their walk, which was completely separate from the Ice Bucket Challenge, was up about 40%. So that behavior had changed belief in the community at large to such an extent that people would ask in an entirely different property or initiative, said yes, because they had been part of the Ice Bucket Challenge, and that had residue in terms of belief.
So as Katrina said, you've got your volunteers, and you want to use recognition to instill this intrinsic label that they're a Down syndrome evangelist or a, whatever it is, warrior for your organization. Well, there are a number of ways you can do it. One is just, the best and the easiest is just to call them one-to-one, talk to them one-to-one, recognize them. That is the most powerful way. Another way is to actually have them speak to other volunteers. Katrina mentioned the Relay for Life, the American Cancer Society. Many of the chapters had a rule that said none of the staff would be allowed to talk to the volunteers. It had to be another volunteer. Only the volunteers could talk to volunteers at their events.
And only volunteers could ever have the microphone. So if there was anything happening on stage, the volunteer was the one talking. They had something that they still use, and many of the larger nonprofits use in this space, called a staff volunteer partnership. So if I am a leadership volunteer, meaning I make meaningful decisions as a volunteer, I have a staff partner, somebody that I'm aligned with who is my mentor, who helps me access the resources of the nonprofit, who probably tells me when I'm maybe a little out of line and maybe you shouldn't put your logo on, a bar or whatever, things like that. And that partnership works really well. The other, I'm not sure if I hit this earlier, but one of the things about peer-to-peer is that we often think about it only in terms of money. But in fact, peer-to-peer recruitment of volunteers works super well and is a form of recognition. If I trust you enough to ask you to come and do a job, that means you're something. you know? So whether a staff person is inviting someone to chair an event or inviting someone to be a team captain, that's a sign of trust and admiration and recognition.
Yeah, and then the other way that we use recognition is with these little items. This is a little wristband. We do a lot of these things. We actually ship them for our clients and so forth. And, you know, whenever you give gifts, we found that they've been very effective, but you have to be very careful that people don't ever think that they're being compensated in a financial sense. So, you know, less is more with this. And
you know, and that can be very difficult because if you have sponsors, for example, let's say that Starbucks maybe is one of your sponsors, and how do they want to sponsor you? They want to give you $25 gift cards, right? That's how they want to do it. And that's awfully nice of them, but it really puts you in an awkward situation because anytime you hand it to anyone, you start to monetize your relationship. It's really uncomfortable. A better solution perhaps would be to say, how about I have a volunteer leadership meeting in your Starbucks and we serve coffee, you know? It's kind of a pain, you know, it would be easy just to give that card. It's so easy, but it really can damage your relationship quite a bit.
yeah, you know, our guidelines, anytime you give anything to a volunteer, 3 things. It should always be branded. You should never give anything to anybody that doesn't have your logo on it, okay? It should be of modest value, and it should hopefully be otherwise unavailable. You know, if it's a T-shirt, the only way that that person could have gotten the T-shirt was to do that, whatever it is for your organization. So it's kind of a trophy.
Yep.
So if you've got extra I hate it when people say, we've got extra T-shirts, we're just going to give them out to people. No, send them to, they need them in Africa, so, you know,
Somewhere else.
somewhere.
Yes,
Send them
not
out
here.
of the country.
One of
not
the
here.
conversations you'll get into is with your board, because your board wants to, you know, typically they're well-to-do people and they want to donate their timeshare or their DACA, the word? Their nice vacation home to your nonprofit, dacha, to your nonprofit for you to use. And it's really awkward telling them, not the best, not the best. You know, anytime you monetize a relationship, and with board members, you almost have to teach them this. You do have to teach them this because they feel unappreciated if they don't understand why you're going, you know, I would really rather have a $5,000 check. That's really, that's what we want. All right.
You know, and yet we see the language of the marketplace all the time in nonprofits. With our clients, we try to help scrub this kind of language out, offering discounts. You know, that's what stores do. That's not what charities do. These kinds of things.
Susan Komen, you guys are familiar with Susan G. Komen Race for the Cure? That's a big breast cancer charity in the United States. They are, we've helped them make this transition. They're about 75% there. And what we're doing with them is scrubbing the market relationship language out of their messaging and out of their event construct. The Susan Komen Race for the Cure was one of the first big peer-to-peer endeavors, and they really built it on what's called a participation model, meaning they built their business model on the idea that people would pay $35 and they would get tens of thousands, and they did, and that's how they would raise money. And that seemed really great until Relay for Life came along and just blew the doors off everything. Relay for Life was not a participation model. The Relay for Life was a fundraising model. And what that meant is that their registration fee was zero or very low, and they counted on people fundraising instead of just participating. 2 very different things. So when Susan G. Komen saw that Relay was raising so much more money, they wanted to transition their property. That was really hard because if you remember earlier, once you've monetized a relationship, it's hard to get back. And it's been really difficult for them. They had to create a new event name, More Than Pink, instead of Race for the Cure, and move people to the new property with the new event construct, which looks and feels completely different from what was a 5K. We'll talk more about 5Ks at some point. Yeah.
Yeah, this is just a particularly awful example. Everything that you could do wrong, they've done here in this. You know, raise big, win, amazing rewards. Yeah.
Yep. The platform provider actually sent this to us with like sad faces all over their email. They're like, can you fix it?
This is the best gift that Turnkey ever gave to our volunteers, to one of the client's volunteers. You want to talk about this?
Sure. So the phrase that we use when we talk about gifts and what makes a great gift is the phrase insufficient justification, meaning the gift or the recognition is of insufficient justification for the action that I'm asking for. So there's no way that you would ever do what I'm asking you to do just to get the gift. If that's true, it's a good gift. If it's true that my gift is enough to get you to do the behavior, it's a bad gift. And that's so counterintuitive, and it's hard explaining that to a board member or a sponsor. This gift is arguably the cheapest, least attractive gift that I have ever produced. We produced about 200,000 of them in China, had them shipped to the US. The blood drops blink. So it's a plastic blinking blood drop necklace. Just saying it makes me ill, right?
Yeah, it's hard to appreciate just how ugly this thing is. Yeah.
Horrible. It raised so much money. And the reason it raised money was because it was really visible. The bar was actually, for the people who got it pretty low, we asked them to raise $100 US 5 months before their event, which was crazy, right? That's so early. But the people who did it, the blinky, flashy blood drop necklace, 5 months later was on the track at the walk. And it worked brilliantly. And there's no way. I mean, this thing was like, it was really nasty. It was terrible. But it worked brilliantly. Yes?
Well, the thing is that this year, I was at this conference on volunteer fundraising in New Orleans, and I'd like to add something. I was shocked. I was really amazed. And there was this session which was called Fast and Short Things which are going to help you increase your fundraising. And there was this woman from Leukemia Foundation, and I'm going to tell you about one thing which helped me raise $500,000 more. And these very small badges, each badge cost me 50 cents. And this badge reads, I collected $1,000. And to get that badge, people would collect tens of thousands of dollars just to put this badge here stating, I collected $1,000, and somebody had 5 badges, 10 badges, and they kept on collecting those badges to feel proud. And that badge cost 35 cents, and that's how they.
That's right.
Mita?
Yeah.
Could you ask?
Yes.
We have a question.
So on behalf of volunteers, I can say which presents are very good. I received a gift from the fund. I wear it with pride, and I got it not because of certain merits, but just because I came along and became interested. I also was a volunteer at the Football World Cup, and we received a lot of gifts, presents as volunteers, but one of the most pleasant ones were these simplest ones, the postcards, the stickers, which we received not because of a certain reason, but just like that. We would turn up for the shift, and our team leaders would say, okay, here is yet another small gift, a sticker, and that gave us a good mood for the rest of the day, and there was this desire to keep coming, to keep participating in that. We didn't have this goal to achieve something, but stimulated us to reappear at all these events again and again. And it was not for stickers, but we came there for emotions, and that was the most important gift of all, emotions, just like at other events. So World Cup was a crazy emotional event for everyone, and with the fund help is needed, I keep coming for the same level of emotions, which I get when I communicate with Katya, with other volunteers, with those who are interested in helping just for that, not asking for anything in reward.
That was great. You just described a social relationship, right? That's exactly what it is. When I would ask you, say, well, it's just the right thing to do. Makes me feel right. So that's exactly what you just described. Let's talk, I'm going to let you talk about this, the email recognition.
So recognition is, as we say in the US, the easy button. You know, it is a button that is on every human, and we just have to figure out how to press it. And recognition can be delivered in a lot of different ways. That cheesy necklace was recognition. I have a feeling the story was about recognition.
Yes, stickers
Yeah.
at the World Cup, yes.
Stickers at the World Cup, yeah, recognition. The opportunity to deliver recognition is vastly expanded now. When I first started in nonprofit, literally the best way we could deliver recognition in a measurable fashion was to stock product in a warehouse and ship it to people who had fundraised large amounts. That created enough data that we could find out if our plan was a good one and if we were producing a positive ROI. Now, when we send someone an email, that can be a recognition email. And by recognition email, what we mean is that that email is sent in response to a behavior that they have exhibited that we can mark in our database so that we can trigger a message against it in some fashion. So there are lots of different ways to deliver recognition. Social media now is an opportunity. The most powerful recognition is person to person, you know, reaching out, shaking someone's hand and saying, thank you for what you did. You know, we appreciate you. Well, actually, there's one more powerful thing, and that's putting them on stage. Putting them on stage. Putting them on stage as a fundraiser or a leadership volunteer is the best thing you can do. But let's talk about email recognition right now, because that's something that we can measure and we can understand the impact. So we had a client who said, I don't buy it. I don't believe it. I don't think that sending email recognition is going to produce more than simply sending a blast email to the entire audience. Prove it. That's what they said, because, you know, it's hard work to trigger emails against particular behaviors. So we did. We sent one group emails about the event, emails about the success of the event. These emails were not personalized to that particular person's behavior. And then the other test group was given an email about their own behavior, and the email sounded like this. Suzanne, you've raised $1,000 for the Down Syndrome Society. Thank you so much. It was that simple. And this was the difference in performance in those two different groups that we were testing. There were a commensurate amount of fundraisers, active fundraisers in each group, but the people who got messaging about themselves performed so much better. You know, we always hear people love to hear stories. Well, it turns out the one story that they're most tuned into is the story about themselves. So that's what we give them. And that's recognition delivered via email. Okay.
We got some great questions. And, you know, this morning has been about why peer-to-peer works. And we're going to talk more about how to make it work after our break. But one of the things that people talked about was they had so many folks that were registering and then they weren't doing any fundraising for them. Now we call these zeros. We call them $0 fundraisers in the United States. And, you know, don't be surprised, because the average for any campaign across many, many campaigns in the United States is 68% who register and then don't fundraise. You know, it's a big number. And that number is consistent from year to year. And the number's higher for smaller organizations, somewhat lower for the bigger organizations, but it's a very stable number. And so, you know, there's a gentleman, a professor at the University of Chicago, who deals with fundraising. He's a psychologist as well, and he says, well, don't worry about the 68%. That means you've got a third of your folks who have, we call it activated. They've started to fundraise. Focus your limited resources on that 1/3. But, you know, what if you didn't? So one of the things that we did was we sent this message to about 50,000 $0 fundraisers in a couple of campaigns, and we basically said, hey, thank you for registering. You're awesome. Would you like a sticker, a decal to put on your bike or your car or whatever it is? And of the people that responded to this outreach, we had about 15% say, yes, I'd like the decal. This was the difference in fundraising for the people that asked for the sticker and the people who, just the average fundraiser. So this, well, again, we didn't just send out the sticker to everyone. You had to ask for it, because what kind of people asked for the decals? People who are supporters. So that was a very key part of that. And I just want to finish with, Katrina mentioned we talked to boards of directors and so forth. And sometimes we'll get the comment, gosh, this seems very manipulative. I don't know if it's a good thing or not to manipulate people to fundraise like this. And I always point them to this book, Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates People. And Daniel Pink describes what an area of psychology called self-determination theory, although he doesn't refer to it as that. But what self-determination theory has found is that people who are satisfied with their jobs, their marriage, their life in general, they talk about having three things. The first is they have a sense of autonomy. They are in control of their own situation, all right? The second thing is they have an opportunity to develop competence, that they can get better at something that's important. And the third is that they're connected to something bigger than themselves. So, what I talk about with boards of directors is that nonprofits have the opportunity to give these people these things in spades. In fact, for many people that become involved in nonprofit, it becomes the most important aspects of their life. And there's research that says that if people who are involved in 2 or more nonprofits actually have a lower risk of death than people who are involved in no nonprofit activity. So it's that fundamental to our well-being. What's that? It is true. It is absolutely true. Absolutely true.
So that means we can manipulate people into being healthier and happier. It makes you pretty bold, when you go to ask people for their time, their money, and their energy. And in this scenario, their influence. That's what we're asking them for, is their influence. All right, so we're going to wrap up right now. Yep, we're going to wrap right now. Are we on time? Yes. Okay.